Her seeming glorification of Vladimir Putin. It is hard to understand, coming from the country that defeated the Soviet Union in the Cold War, that we would put a woman in charge of our entire intelligence community who has shown over and over repeated interest in Vladimir Putin, taking his side of the argument, wondering what he's done right and our intelligence community has done wrong.
You put it that way. That was Michigan Senator Elissa Slotkin. She's a former CIA agent, laying out and articulating the case against Tulsi Gabbard, who Russian state media describes as, quote, their girl to be the American Director of National Intelligence. Of course, she came up short. The United States Senate, controlled by Republicans, confirmed Tulsi Gabbard to lead those 18 different intelligence agencies responsible for thwarting threats to Americans here and abroad. She was sworn in a few moments ago. Gabbard was confirmed by a vote of 52 to 48, with all 47 Democrats, as well as Mitch McConnell, voting against her. A brutal bit of irony from the man who used to control the Republican Party, now finding himself casting what is basically an ineffective dissent to oppose a nominee who Russia is cheering for. Within an hour of Gabbard's confirmation, Donald Trump announced that he and Vladimir Putin would immediately begin negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. We're back with Claire and David. Claire, we need more Claire.
Yeah, I can't tell you how disappointed I am in my former Republican colleagues, who many of whom know better. And you know, I think there's a certain irony that I would quote Mitch McConnell today. Mitch McConnell said, "It's her judgment." Do you really want somebody in charge of this really sensitive and important part of protecting our national security, someone who's had such poor judgment in the past? I mean, all these people claim they've, whether it's RFK saying now he's okay with vaccines, or whether it's Kash Patel, trying to convince people that he hasn't said that he wants to tear down the FBI building and make it a museum. Forget all these people like trying to disavow who they were. This shows her lack of judgment. And Lisa Murkowski knows that. Susan Collins knows that. Todd Young knows that. Bill Cassidy knows that. These guys, they all know it. And they wouldn't vote for her no matter what if she was nominated for this by a Democrat. And the reason she was a Democrat is because a lot of her views of the world were really far left. So, these guys have lost their minds. They've just lost their minds. I don't know what else to say.
David.
In a bubble, you like to think Mitch McConnell's having a John McCain moment, but Mitch McConnell always seems to disappoint, and John McCain rarely did. I think we can't overlook the real significant national security geopolitical story that happened this morning. And for much as we see the Trump administration as chaos, today was clearly so well coordinated. Tulsi Gabbard is confirmed, while Pete Hegseth is addressing NATO, saying Ukraine has to give up their sovereign territory to Russia, while Donald Trump's on the phone with Vladimir Putin, engaging in a prisoner swap, but also saying we're going to reach some type of peace agreement. And by the way...
And have two summits.
Yeah, and have two summits. We're going to have state visits by Putin and Trump. Today was the day, not surprising, right? We knew all this was happening. This is part of where MAGA is. But boy, a pivot in American foreign policy. And I think in Mitch McConnell's vote, he sees that. To Claire's point, all these other senators see it as well. They just collapsed and fell in line. But in terms of our own national security and in terms of pivoting America's posture on the world stage, today was a heavy, heavy day just a few weeks into the Trump administration.
Well, let me ask both of you. I hear what you were saying, Claire. I'm about 4 years beyond being able to be disappointed by the Republicans because I think this is who they've become. Let me ask you, I think most of them know better. There are a couple who maybe seem to not, but the vast majority of them know better. So they decided to do this. Why?
Because Donald Trump won in a more convincing fashion than most people anticipated. Because he won in spite of all the things he has done and shown the American people about his character and integrity. Because their party, the base of their party, is enthralled with this man. Some of the people I mentioned have elections coming up in states that they could easily be defeated in a primary by a pro-MAGA Republican. I'm sure that part of Susan Collins's calculation is she became convinced that Tulsi Gabbard was not going to do some things she liked. And she knows that if a MAGA Republican got nominated in Maine and beat her in a primary, that they would be defeated in the general, because that's a state that Kamala Harris won and Joe Biden won. And it's a state that Susan Collins has held on to because she has been thoughtful and moderate in many instances, not all, but in many instances. So I think it's this primary coming up for many of them, and the pressure they feel that their party has been basically the party they knew has disappeared in terms of issues like how we treat our enemies like Russia. That is no longer, I mean, whether it's free trade or hawkish views on foreign defense, or standing up for the rule of law, the Republican Party is not who the Republican Party used to be. And I think they're all searching for a home and are uncomfortable in the home they find themselves in.
So politics, which is what I thought, and that's just pathetic. It's like shining your shoes on the deck of the Titanic. Susan Collins wants to make sure her, heels don't get stubbed as she's going down underwater. It's absolutely, I mean, I thought that was the reason. I wasn't sure, but that's sick. They're there for 6 years so that every now and again they do the right thing for the country. That's I'm sure you're correct, but that's a tragedy.
Donald Trump, the man and his career, has lived within the courts and lived with those ups and downs and losses. He's been right there at that defendant's table because he had to be. Remember, he didn't defy the trial. He complained. At times he was caught allegedly breaking parts of the rules. But in the main, he went to court every day. And in the main at the Supreme Court, he waited to see what they would say. And that's been true up and down. So faced with the current bad news of these legal losses, he and his allies right now are running two plays. And I'm just going to explain them in plain English to you. They may be familiar. Number one is distract from the bad news with their own new and controversial claims. So just try to get up attention that way. It's not just Trump, although he loves his attention. He has a lot of people who got here, including his vice president, by quite publicly mimicking him and his approach. And some of these things are not that complicated. Anyone with an internet connection and a phone or any other source of news has seen this before. You're losing badly, that's the headline. Say something so outrageous, even so unlawful or un-American, that it draws in that attention. Number two, push, intimidate, and try to hammer the courts to press more of them towards this Trump view. And that strategy might be rewarded in a Supreme Court that, as I just reminded you, at times has cut against Trump, but other times has been very helpful to him. Those are basically the two moves. I'm not going to try to make it any more dramatic or complicated than that for any particular storytelling reason, but these are the two things going on. They are somewhat familiar. They have consequences. The first move is still just PR. Replace the headlines any which way. They're eating the dogs. They're eating the cats. The second move is a type of legal strategy, not inside out, saying here's a good legal argument in court where they're losing these first rounds, but outside in. Let's make so much noise and ride this wave and scare people and try to get the federal judges to err on the side or allow more than they normally would, thinking that this will work or the Supreme Court ultimately won't do anything about it. Or, if you want to get closer to a constitutional crisis, daring the courts to intercede because maybe if they stay out of it, it won't get to the point where you actually have a federal politician defying all their orders or a Supreme Court order and we get to that crisis point. In other words, scare them that you would do that to the point that they back out. But of course, judges aren't supposed to do that. They're not supposed to bow to politicians' threats to not follow the rule of law and our orders. Their orders, the judges, I mean. Now, the fact that Donald Trump has lived with and followed court orders for a long time is relevant to that second move I'm telling you about, because the hype of it and the fear of it basically requires everyone to go along and kind of listen to the hype and make people perhaps overly pessimistic or even surrendering in advance.
I think he should take a page out of Andrew Jackson's playbook. At some point, J.D. Vance is right when J.D. said, hold on, you can't have a judge step in when the president is exercising his constitutional authority.
The executive branch is the ultimate authority on federal issues, and we have rogue judges who are trying to stop members like Doge Team, Bessent, from doing their job.
The last voice, a Trump legal advisor, is stating something that she has every right to say, right? You have free speech rights and people can debate this all out. But it is false. So I will tell you that. And I don't know if she got enough of a fact check in that particular interview we're quoting, but the fact check is no. The executive branch does not have the final say on matters, federal or any other matters, because the courts in this country rule on the law. And that's why there are these clashes. And people know this. People have generally supported it, right? Constitutional principles do better when there is some broad understanding and support for them. But Trump is trying to test how far this will go. Now, I'll give you another example that sounds bad. It sounds like it's bad to say that a sitting president is for foreign bribery. Why would you be for that? Indeed, there was an entire impeachment about shaking down Ukraine for abusing power for what could have amounted allegedly to a bribe. And the denial then was the president and Donald Trump saying, we weren't trying to do a foreign bribe. Keep that in mind, as tonight we have the news that the DOJ under Trump is going to make it easier to do foreign bribes. Now, here's the context. Past presidents have used lawful powers in deciding prosecutorial priorities. So presidents have de-emphasized at times low-level offenses like personal marijuana use or civil immigration offenses. They don't usually say those laws are meaningless or they're canceled, but they say that within law, in consultation with the lawyers I mentioned in government, they may change the dial on that. Tonight, Donald Trump is now trying a whole different version of that stems out of what the DOJ admitted this week, but with far more serious laws. I mentioned the U.S. has long opposed corruption abroad, and there are laws that prevent American companies from bribing foreign officials. Literally that simple. And that has been bipartisan, but now Trump is taking his party in a different direction and his administration blatantly embracing the prospect of current and future corruption, saying under Trump, the DOJ will no longer enforce. They are halting investigations and prosecutions of corruption in foreign countries. They're not saying there isn't corruption. They're saying they just won't prosecute it, and that corruption could become the United States competitive edge. That is extreme. From a honesty perspective, it is bananas, or any other word you want to use. The Times says it's a quite transactional approach to corruption cases. So there are many things going on. I've told you we will try to focus on what matters and pick and choose things, because we're not going to do everything. And we are going to dictate what we determine over the course of the day is important, significant news for you, and not just follow the bouncing ball. This one's important. Republicans used to back that law. It passed overwhelmingly bipartisan, and I'll just remind you the headlines at the time in the late 70s viewed it as pretty straightforward. This was the New York Times, December 77, Senate backs foreign bribery bill to limit and punish foreign bribery. Because who would be for bribery? Who would say that's good, foreign bribery? But here we are. Now, this move is not about domestic politics. It's not about even MAGA necessarily, although some other related moves might be. This is just a reminder of things that they didn't campaign on, that they aren't necessarily doing press conferences with Elon Musk about, and yet that matter a lot. It's a blatant embrace of letting American companies do foreign corruption and bribery. It's that simple. Now, the MAGA part coordinates with Trump using executive power twice in corruption-related cases, and both for Democrats. Okay? I'm going to explain this, but it's both interesting and many legal scholars and experts say concerning. Trump had already pardoned a Democratic governor, Rod Blagojevich. He had been previously imprisoned for selling Obama's Senate seat, for trying to, all the way back in 2008. Now, this week, he's been fully pardoned. So he was already out of prison. This is a messaging embrace. There's no big physical change there. And Trump's DOJ now ordering prosecutors to drop what were corruption charges against New York City Mayor Eric Adams. Like Trump in the other case I mentioned, presumed innocent at this stage before trial, but facing those corruption charges. And there are even reports that Trump officials have a very specific agenda here. One, showing that, hey, Democrats do it too, which is why you want anti-corruption of all parties, of course, but they're trying to make it seem like this is a runaway witch hunt against everybody. And two, abuse federal power over the DOJ to maybe get some other cooperation with Trump's, quote, crackdown on immigrants. Now, this is all happening in the open. Bribery's okay, personal lawyers at DOJ, and then saying, we will give you what you need out of this federal legal power if you go along with what we want. AOC, Democratic member of Congress, stating her concern about this.
Given how President Trump operates, how he absolutely seems to be gutting the Department of Justice, the FBI, if they are kind of wielding this prospect of charges coming back over a sitting mayor of the nation's largest city, I think that creates a very significant concern.
AOC's warning there. Mayor Adams, of course, can tell his side of this story, and we will always follow the facts, and we will include denials when we get them. But we are talking about one of the greatest powers that exists, the power to prosecute or the power to pardon, and not just being used in the controversial ways I've mentioned, but basically as what sounds like a quid pro quo, or what they also sometimes call a bribe. You do this, I'll do that. And then you say, gosh, well, does that mean the sitting current president is open to quid pro quo bribes? Didn't he deny all that in the impeachment case I mentioned? But then you have to remember, this is coming on the week where he very blatantly is also using the same DOJ to say, bribes abroad, that's fine now. We promise not to investigate or prosecute it. A lot of this is out in the open for a reason. And what do you do if you are a powerful mayor of a big city with obligations, constitutional oath to your citizens, your own security, NYPD, the biggest police force other than FBI, and yet you also have maybe this pardon hanging over your head, that they take it back or they restart the case, which is what AOC is warning could be a problem? What do you do in that situation?
Joining me now, Wall Street Journal chief economics reporter Nick Timiraos, MSNBC political analyst and former Republican congressman from Florida, Carlos Curbelo. Here in studio with me, NBC News senior business correspondent Christine Romans. Welcome to all. So, Christine, what exactly does this report tell us, and what might it mean for our wallets?
It means this last mile of the inflation fight is bumpy, and you've got inflation back here at 3%. That's not the 2% target the Fed would like to see. It kind of handcuffs the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates anytime soon, and it means we're paying more for things like auto insurance, airfares, fuel oil. I mean, look at the progress, Chris, from the 9% inflation, right? So we've made a lot of progress, but look, the very far right of that chart shows inflation ticking up again. So still hotter than the Fed would like to see and families would like to see.
So how are the markets taking it?
So wobbling in the stock market. And look, what's happening in the markets is they're trying to figure out when, if the Fed will be able to cut interest rates anytime this year. Because when you have inflation that's too hot, you don't want to be cutting interest rates and potentially making it worse. So watching kind of the stock market wobble a little bit. But listen, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty about what the president's policies are going to mean for inflation. When I talk to companies and when you listen to earnings calls, what they talk about is how much more it will cost to make their product or to do their business, not how much less because of the policies on the table right now.
Nick, it caught my eye yesterday when you wrote that not every monthly inflation report is created equal. So talk about why this one matters so much.
Well, Chris, if you think about how businesses operate, a lot of times if they had higher costs in the past year, they change their prices not every month. They might do it at the end of the year. So as we turn into a new year, we've seen the past several years, January tends to have more inflation. And the hope had been that we were finally past all of that. And so as you changed into a new calendar year, you didn't have these big price resets happening this January that you did in 24, that you did in 2023. And the news this morning was just not good. It shows that there are still inflationary pressures in the system. And so that just is going to make it harder to get on top of this.
Christine touched on this, Nick, but what does this all signal to the Federal Reserve?
Well, she's right. It's going to keep the Fed on hold here, and Donald Trump may not be happy about that. He tweeted this morning that he wanted to see interest rates come down. I think this is a reminder of how different the economy that he inherited this time is from the economy he inherited 8 years ago when inflation was very low, and it made it easier to push for lower interest rates. It made it easier to do things like imposing tariffs that push up the price of imported goods. This time around, we're talking about more tariffs. We're talking about larger tariff hikes, and you're doing it in an economy that has higher inflation and where businesses have the experience of being able to push along price increases to their customers that they did not have 8 years ago.
I want to go back to tariffs in a minute, but Congressman, let's remember how easy Donald Trump said it would be for him. But prices rose a lot for eggs, 15.2% from December to January. That's the largest increase since June of 2015. Our NBC local team in L.A. is reporting that some Californians are actually turning to local farms to get eggs. Look at this long line of cars in Chino. They're snaking around the block just to try to find some eggs. I guess the key political question here is how long are people willing to wait for something that they were promised would happen on day one, which was 23 days ago?
That's right, Chris. And of course, the egg situation is exacerbated by the bird flu and all the chickens that have had to have been killed. But at the end of the day, people don't care about those explanations. And we certainly saw that during the Biden administration. President Biden and his team continuously explained to the American people that inflation was better in the United States than the rest of the world, that our economy was stronger than the economies of the rest of the world, that his administration had passed the CHIPS Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill. At the end of the day, people were frustrated by high prices, and that's something that now Donald Trump and Republicans are going to have to contend with. When people go to the polls in the fall of next year, this is the biggest question that's going to be on their minds. Did Trump and Republicans actually make inflation better? Did they make life more affordable in the United States? Right now, they're seeing how difficult that is, and these inflationary pressures aren't allowing interest rates to come down. And of course, that has a big effect on the rest of the economy and on businesses' plans for investment, for job creation. So this is the one issue. There's a lot out there, especially in this early going of the Trump administration, a lot to cover. But this is the one issue that politically will matter most.
That brings us back to tariffs, Nick. When Donald Trump said that this was going to be easy, this is a very complicated situation, but talk specifically about tariffs and how that could impact inflation.
Well, tariffs could send prices up. If they don't, the Trump administration argues that they won't send consumer prices up. They could send the dollar up, and what that would mean is that U.S. manufacturers, companies that export, it becomes more expensive for them to do that. It puts them at a little bit of a disadvantage. And, Trump's Treasury Secretary last year warned that tariffs were inflationary. He wrote this in a letter to his investors before he was really in the picture to become the Treasury Secretary. So there is some awareness, I think, inside the Trump administration that they've got different levers to pull here. They will argue that bringing down energy prices, that cutting government spending might help in the other direction. But it's just a more complicated situation right now than when we had tariffs in 2018 and 19.
And it's so interesting, I think, Carlos, that we're seeing pushback on the tariffs from Republican Senator Mitch McConnell. He even penned an op-ed writing for his local paper, quote, "Kentuckians can't afford the high cost of Trump's tariffs." He even calls tariffs bad policy. He warned it could cost the average Kentuckian $1,200 a year. I wonder if you think the combination of the inflation report, the concern that a lot of Republicans are expressing over tariffs might serve as a warning to Donald Trump.
Well, not only that, Chris, but in the CBS News poll that's been covered this week, most Americans responded that they oppose tariffs against Canada and Mexico. More tolerance for tariffs against China. I think people understand that there's a competition issue there and that the Chinese really don't allow our companies to compete on a level playing field. But when it comes to our neighbors, People don't want those tariffs, and people are making the connection between tariffs and higher prices and inflation. So yes, I think the Trump administration is going to have to rethink the tariff strategy, especially if inflation remains persistent.
We're tracking all of this with NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett Haake, the New York Times chief White House correspondent and NBC political analyst Peter Baker, and MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. Garrett, this DOJ subcommittee hearing that we're monitoring is part of the Oversight Committee. Musk faced questions about lack of transparency and oversight yesterday in the Oval Office. How's he responding?
Well, Musk's argument is that he is being transparent by posting about the cuts and the projects that DOJ is canceling on X and on DOJ's website. He also said something kind of unusual for a Trump White House-related press conference. He said, I'm going to make mistakes, I'm going to screw stuff up, and essentially that the oversight he's getting is from the public. Take a listen to part of what he had to say about this during that Oval Office presser yesterday.
It's not draconian or radical. The people voted for major government reform. There should be no doubt about that. That was on the campaign. The president spoke about that at every rally. The people voted for major government reform, and that's what people are going to get. They're going to get what they voted for. It's not like I think I can get away with something. I'll be scrutinized nonstop.
Musk also said, or did not say, I suppose is the right way to frame this, that he's recused himself from any particular piece of business. He was asked repeatedly about contracts with the Pentagon, for example, where SpaceX is a major contractor, and said that he hasn't touched anything related to that yet. There's no indication that he won't when it comes the time to do that.
And we're going to talk more about potential conflicts of interest in just a moment. But Peter, just if we take a step back, the visuals of all of that, Musk in the Oval Office, President Trump in some ways almost appeared to be a sidekick to Musk. Were you surprised to see President Trump see the spotlight like that?
Yeah, that's pretty unusual for a Trump White House, no question about it. There's only one, maestro of the Trump circus, and that's President Trump. He doesn't like to see the spotlight. He doesn't like it when somebody takes the stage, in effect, and upstages. And now we don't know how he felt about this. It was his, inclination to give Elon Musk this spotlight. But you watch his face as Musk goes on, and you can sort of interpret what you see there as somebody who might not necessarily, accept this kind of upstaging for very long. It's not his nature. But look, Elon Musk has been empowered to be a virtual prime minister in this government. He's been given extraordinary latitude. We've never seen anything quite like this. And so this is the first time that he subjected himself to, questioning by reporters. And that's actually kind of important.
And Garrett, minutes after that press gaggle with Musk, President Trump actually put out an order giving DOJ even more power over the federal workforce. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this executive order is in the form of a memo, essentially instructions for agencies about how they should look at their workforce after this hiring freeze that exists now ends. It suggests that any agency can only replace one person for any 4 people removed during this cutting process that's going on now. And it also calls for continued large-scale staff reductions. The memo says that the goal here should be to dramatically reduce the civilian workforce for the federal government, and that agencies should look to do so by any legal means available to them, and that they should clear this process through their DOJ representatives. So this blitz that we're seeing from Elon Musk and his team doesn't appear to be fading away anytime soon on it.
The New York Times points out that Musk could actually profit from some of these moves to hobble or downsize agencies. At least 11 federal agencies that have been affected by those moves have more than 32 continuing investigations, pending complaints or enforcement actions into Musk's 6 companies. So, Lisa, a Republican Congress seems unlikely to really put the screws to Musk and Trump over all of this. But I'm just wondering, are there other legal levers in place to prevent this kind of self-dealing in scenarios like this?
It depends. I mean, I think it's up to the courts, but it's also up to the American people and those who have been injured or who could claim plausible injury from some of these actions to bring the sort of legal cases that would bring these sorts of conflicts of interest to the fore. If somebody can say plausibly that they have been concretely injured by Elon Musk's self-dealing, they might have the kind of claim that would lead to a successful court fight. But we haven't quite seen that materialize yet, Anna, in part because there's a lack of transparency around what Doge is doing, despite Elon Musk's claims that all that information is available on his website or through Doge's X account.
And there's just so much happening, it's hard to keep up. Peter, you point out that some of the most contentious moves that we've seen in the past few weeks were ideas that President Trump toyed with the last time around, but was ultimately persuaded to drop. So what is driving this apparently emboldened and more decisive Trump 2.0?
Well, look, President Trump came out of his first term convinced that he had made mistakes when it came to personnel. That's the only mistake he's ever actually really conceded. And of course, the mistake are the people who are around him and tried to thwart him or talk him out of things or tell him things he wanted to do were illegal or unconstitutional or unwise. This time around, he has a better sense of himself and his presidency. He knows a little bit more about what he wants to get done and how to do it. Remember, when he came to office 8 years ago for the first time, he was the only president we'd ever had in history who hadn't spent a single day in public office of the military. So it was all new to him, and he surrounded himself by people he didn't really know, many of whom were actually establishment Republicans who didn't think that who viewed their jobs as trying to keep him from going too far. Now he surrounded himself by people who are more like-minded, who have their own, very sometimes extreme ideas about how things should be done. And they're not only, enabling him, they're encouraging him.
Again, we're watching this hearing that's underway, the Doge subcommittee in the House. We'll let you know if there's anything that really pops from this. But Garrett, just in the last 24 hours or so, Trump's fired another watchdog. We've learned he's shuffled around the ICE leadership positions. Get us up to speed on some of these moves.
Yeah, on the Inspector General's front, the White House has fired the Inspector General of USAID in a fairly terse email that essentially says, you've been terminated effective immediately. Thank you for your service. That Inspector General had just published a report about the effects and the both real and human costs of the rapid downscaling of USAID and its mission. The White House hasn't commented on that, but presumably with their intent to fold USAID into the State Department, they view any work done by that IG could probably be handled by state. As for ICE, the top two officials on the enforcement side, our team has learned, have been demoted. They've been replaced at the top of the enforcement side by the person who had been running the ICE office in Boston. This comes amid reporting, including from NBC News, that the president has been growing frustrated that the pace of arrests and deportations isn't faster. The White House has denied that reporting. The president has shrugged it off, but clearly that is not the case given this move to replace top leadership at Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
And Lisa, for those keeping track at home, the Trump administration is now facing more than 50 lawsuits to some of these actions that we're seeing. And in fact, judges have paused, halted, or reversed at least 9 Trump policies. Here's how the president reacted yesterday.
And it seems hard to believe that judges want to try and stop us from looking for corruption. And it seems hard to believe that a judge could say, we don't want you to do that. Well, so maybe we have to look at the judges, because that's a very serious, I think it's a very serious violation. I always abide by the courts, always abide by them, and will appeal.
I always abide by the courts, will appeal, also criticizing the judges. Your reaction?
I am somewhat comforted that the president is saying that I will always abide by the courts. Certainly the American people now have that representation, and they should hold him to it. There is also an escalation by the Department of Justice right now in fighting back against some of those pauses that you were talking about. We're seeing them, for example, in one federal appeals court fighting back against a broad temporary restraining order on freezes of federal funding. They are also fighting back hard against the temporary restoration of one of the officials they fired, the head of the Office of Special Counsel, in another appeals court. So one way or another, some of these issues are going to percolate up to appeals courts and perhaps beyond fast. One other thing to look for today is a confirmation hearing for Todd Blanche, who will be the number 2 at the Department of Justice. Senators may ask him about his role and his view of the Department of Justice, because they are the defense team for any federal agency that is sued in some of these cases about the executive actions that President Trump has taken. Whether or not he views himself as a constraint on DOJ and how he sees that is something I think we will see explored today, Anna.
And we're going to take some of that confirmation hearing, which is scheduled to get underway in just about 5 minutes or so. Todd Blanche, the number 2 at the Justice Department, his nomination will be before the Senate Judiciary Committee. But we are hearing from Justice Sotomayor weighing in on this brewing conflict between the 3 branches. Without mentioning Trump by name, here's what she said.
Our founders were hell-bent on ensuring that we didn't have a monarchy. And the first way they thought of that was to give Congress the power of the purse. Court decisions stand. Whether one particular person chooses to abide by them or not, it doesn't change the foundation that it's still a court order that someone will respect at some point.
Lisa, we were just discussing how some of these appeals could end up back at the Supreme Court or up to the Supreme Court. Given the current makeup of the court, would you expect President Trump to end up victorious?
It depends on what the issue is. For example, on this issue with the Office of the Special Counsel and his removal powers, the president has a very broad view of his ability to remove anyone at any time for any reason whatsoever, from federal employment, from Senate confirmed positions to the lowest level civil servants. That's certainly going to be tested. I think this is a court that will increasingly endorse his ability to do that. Where it comes to DOJ, on the other hand, that's anyone's guess. This is a new federal agency that essentially has been propped into the role of the United States Digital Service. The way in which they are going about their business with no Senate confirmation, lots of political appointees, no transparency. It's not that the court will endorse corruption and waste. Nobody endorses corruption and waste. But the lack of transparency, the lack of political accountability, you could see a court rein in DOJ in some respects.
And there are laws around the process of how some of these moves are supposed to go, especially with Congress being the oversight body, being able to approve some of those moves.
There is a lot to cover and a lot of moving pieces. So let's get started with NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett Haake, NBC News chief Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles, NBC News investigative reporter Dan DeLuce, and former special assistant to President George W. Bush and a member of his National Security Council, Michael Allen. Ryan, I'll get to you in a moment on the dynamics on Capitol Hill, but first I want to go to the panel here. Dan, your reaction, as you and I both, we were all reading the president's Truth Social post about his call with Vladimir Putin. Several things struck us in that. What was top for you?
I mean, first of all, what's interesting is he doesn't make any kind of threat or warning that Russia needs to, A, halt the fighting, or B, fear that maybe there'll be U.S. sanctions or more weapons going to Ukraine. So there's no mention of that. I think if you're Ukraine, if you're Zelensky, President Zelensky, you have to be concerned, are they talking, are Russia and the U.S. talking without me, without Ukraine? Will they be excluded? I think that's a concern. Another thing that jumps out is there was no mention of the envoy to Ukraine, General Kellogg, who's heading to Europe this week for the Munich conference and is supposed to be the point man. So that was also strange and surprising.
Yeah, I do think that those things were notable. Michael, does this, in your estimation, put Zelensky on his back foot, sort of in a defensive position, given Putin and Trump seem to have already discussed what the path forward might look like?
A little bit. I mean, we've been worried for months and throughout the campaign that Trump might try to pressure Zelensky into some sort of peace arrangement. What's happened is that now the Russians are winning. They're making incremental gains, not gigantic gains. So the thought process is shifted to what leverage does President Trump have over Putin to get him to the table? But what I sense here in the last 24, 48 hours is a breaking of the ice between the United States and Russia. We saw Mark Fogel come out. We saw the Secretary of Defense this morning in Europe say there's no way that Ukraine is going to join NATO. That enabled this call to occur here, and I just think you're going to begin to see more and more movement, meetings, and really serious negotiations about what to do next.
Well, even as the president says in this statement, they want to work together very closely. They want to visit each other's nations. Garrett, I want to bring you in here. What's the White House saying about this and the latest iteration of the Trump-Putin relationship?
Well, look, Ali, I think there are people at the White House who are probably discovering this in real time as we are today. It was pretty closely held how all of this was going on with Russia over the last 24 hours or so. And I want to step back a little bit and relate these things, because you cannot possibly overstate the enormity of the shift that this conversation, that this Truth Social post represents in how the U.S. is treating Russia. Promises to visit these countries, naming a delegation to engage in negotiations about the future of Ukraine, something that the president's been telegraphing for quite some time, by the way. But I do think this started, or at least the jumping off point was the Fogel release. I was on the phone with an official about an hour ago talking about the exchange that took place here and the idea that the White House felt like there was a goodwill gesture here by the Russians, that this was the kind of thing that might start things moving. And I asked this person on the phone, what will the next step look like? Is there some low-level delegation? Is there something that's going to happen to kind of continue to build incrementally on this trust? And I should have thought bigger, because we're seeing it here in real time. And we've seen with Donald Trump so many times in the past. Think about North Korea in the first term, where he jumps right to that leader-to-leader engagement, the way that he likes to deal with foreign leaders. And in this call, you see the kind of fruits of that sort of small bit of trust building, the policy shifts that have been discussed for the duration of the Trump administration and the Trump campaign, kind of layering on top of each other to create what I think Trump and the White House hopes will be a relationship with Putin that can be used to end the war.
Michael, from your perch, having worked in these national security situations, building on trust makes sense, especially for the way that Trump himself relies on his personal relationships to do diplomacy. But this has been a long-standing, tenuous relationship between the United States and Russia.
It really has. It goes back many years, of course, since at least their invasion of Ukraine, the first time in 2014 by taking Crimea. It obviously went really off the road during the Biden administration. We always know about Trump that he wants to get sort of the great power relationships right, even when it makes some of the foreign policy folks in town a little bit nervous. But he's moving forward. I'd almost call them confidence-building measures. It's a costless gesture from Trump to be able to sort of acknowledge that there's no way Ukraine's going to get out of NATO, and it's easy for Putin to be able to release a hostage. So this is just sort of a step-by-step. Let's see how far this goes. And I think Putin and Trump are going to get together in the near future, and that will be a spectacle to behold.